LA Metro has ambitious long-term expansion plans with new lines and extensions that will be opening on a rolling basis from right now until the 2060s, largely thanks to the funding from our Measures R and M sales taxes. But not all projects are created equal. In order to get countywide support for these ballot measures, Metro sprinkled in a lot of lower ridership projects all over the county, even front-loading a lot of them in the construction schedule. And while the D-line extension that will be opening in 3 phases from early next year to 2027 will become the backbone of the system and massively increase ridership, we're not getting another line this crucial for likely a decade and a half. One of these critical home run projects is the Sepulveda line, which just finished its most crucial public comments period, and which will have an alternative selected probably middle of next year from what I'm hearing. Another is the K Northern extension, which should also have its alternative selected early next year, and which I've spent some time harping on about in an attempt to switch phases 2 and 3 to cut and cover. Which has been tough, considering that we're so far down the road already with its draft EIR already complete. These 2 projects will bring a massive disproportionate number of riders into the system and help build out a grid that will make Metro broadly useful for many, many more travel patterns. But there's a third slated backbone project that will also be a huge boost for the system, but which hasn't gotten as much attention. The holy ghost of this holy trinity, if you will. Rail on the Vermont corridor south of Wilshire. A 2023 timeline suggested that the environmental review for rail was supposed to start in January 2025, but that did not happen. Even though this project actually has 0 funding at the moment, with nothing allocated for Measures R or M, a huge failing on the part of those ballot measures, the plan has been to get it under environmental review ASAP so that it's shovel-ready if and when funding is identified. And while actually getting this line built will take some intense effort, given the current lack of funding, it does deserve to be held in the same esteem as Sepulveda and K North. Some background. Vermont is the single busiest bus corridor in LA County, busier even than Wilshire, where the D-line extension is getting built, in part because Vermont passes through much more transit-dependent communities. However, Measure M only provides a corridor with BRT from Sunset to 120th, which is in planning now and making use of recent CEQA exemption allowances. Sadly, though, it will only be a subpar side-running BRT when it begins construction next year. Although, as we'll see, we can turn that to our advantage when it comes to rail. The BRT is scheduled to complete in 2028, at which point Metro will theoretically turn its full attention to rail on this corridor, which had planned to complete the rail study by 2028 for final approval that year. But, because this EIR hasn't begun yet, and it theoretically will soon, presumably with a scoping period first that will help further define the study, this is actually the perfect time to chime in with some ideas that can improve this line. Right now, all we know about what Metro will be studying comes from the rail feasibility study that preceded it, and the bid from the contractor who was hired to do the EIR. And it doesn't look promising. Essentially, it seems like, absent changes during scoping, this line will be exorbitantly expensive without necessity, making it wildly difficult to build given that it currently has no funding, and it will offer subpar service to what could be offered and isn't engaging in any forward-thinking planning that could alter the line slightly to the massive benefit of the future system. But, since there should be a scoping period prior to the study beginning, I think some of the changes we'll discuss can actually make their way into the study as alternatives. As of now, at least, the rail EIR seems that it will be restricted to a narrow study area along Vermont, between roughly Los Feliz Boulevard and El Segundo Boulevard, with an expected route being between Wilshire and 120th. An unchosen contractor proposed instead terminating the line at Westlake MacArthur Park, but there's been no suggestion that that idea will be carried through with the current contractor. A separate, generalized study of the corridor south of 120 to PCH was conducted, but found that projected ridership would be quite low, especially for the expected costs, and recommended against pursuing it in the near term, even as BRT. From the feasibility study, 3 concepts seem to be advancing to the next phase: standalone light rail, standalone heavy rail, and an extension of the B-line heavy rail. It appears that the heavy rail under consideration is the same standard heavy rail that Metro runs on the B and D lines and is also studying as Alternative 6 for the Sepulveda line, certainly for the B extension option at least. It also appears that the feasibility study may have, by default, ruled out both elevated rail and cut and cover, despite this being a perfectly straight corridor as defined in the study area at least, meaning that there are zero curve or property acquisition issues for cut and cover, just utility and disruption issues, and a huge median for elevated rail in the southern section that makes it an absolute no-brainer. The feasibility study also acknowledges the challenges of trying to find a yard site within the study area, and at one point admitted that it may need to go south of the study area to identify a proper site. I'll be upfront and tell you the things that I think need to be evaluated in this study as it begins, things that it doesn't appear it will be evaluating now. First, the highest priority item. The automated heavy rail paradigm proposed by Bechtel for alternatives 4 and 5 of the Sepulveda line should absolutely be the, or at least a, studied alternative for the standalone heavy rail option. It provides better headways with shorter stations that will be significantly cheaper to construct. There is zero reason to stick to the old heavy rail paradigm for standalone lines when this is an option, especially as it feels like it might be chosen for the Sepulveda line, so by the time this is built, it may well be within Metro's established design vernacular. This, without question, needs to be evaluated as part of the study. Second, of almost equally high priority, elevated rail south of gauge has got to be a vertical profile that remains on the table. It's such a perfect, obvious corridor for it. It doesn't have to be the only alternative, and I'm sure the usual NIMBYs will complain about it, but it at least needs to be studied as an option. Third, cut and cover north of gauge, or at least north of Olympic, also deserves to be one of the vertical profile alternatives studied. The latter because a shallow station over rather than under the insanely deep existing Wilshire, Vermont station is just so much cheaper. Great, so it'll be disruptive. Study it and tell us how much so the public can evaluate it. Do it now so we don't have to beg you to go back and do it after the fact. Just look at it. Fourth, there has to be consideration of a standalone alternative expanding northward in the future, necessitating the expansion of the study area to Westlake MacArthur Park as an unchosen contractor suggested, and the evaluation of that as a terminus. Fifth, lower priority, but still important, I think the study area also needs to be expanded southward, both to identify better yard options and to consider terminus stations further south than 120th, but not along the breadth of the whole southern corridor. I'll get more into the specifics of this, but I don't think consideration should actually include just Vermont, and the study area should go a bit wider. Sixth, the BRT is currently being planned more or less with 1 mile station spacing, which is standard for rapid transit, and thus the feasibility study only provides a corridor with heavy rail stations every 2 miles, making it into an express, but one that doesn't serve the corridor nearly as well. Instead, with the construction of the rail, I think Metro should look to increasing BRT to half-mile stops and then building rail stations at 1 mile intervals. And finally, seventh, Metro should evaluate more involved connections to current and potential future lines at Expo and Slauson. I'll expand on that in a bit. Interestingly, the aforementioned contractor not chosen for the EIR, HNTB, actually suggested a number of these solutions, not just the Westlake MacArthur Park terminus, but also a tunnel portal at Gage, eliminating 120th Street Station, which we'll get to, undergrounding the Expo line at Vermont, evaluating cut and cover, and more. So this won't be the first time Metro has heard some of these suggestions. I don't know why HNTB wasn't chosen. It seems to be factors other than their project approach, because Metro scored them higher than the winning contractor on that. But at the very least, I hope the contractor that was chosen can move ahead with these suggestions regardless, especially since Metro's scoring of the contractors may indicate they liked some of these ideas. So, with those issues laid out, let's take a look at this line. The first thing to conclude is that A, this should not be light rail, and B, it should not be a B-line extension. Light rail is simply going to provide worse service, and there's no reason to consider interlining this with any other light rail lines in the future, so we ought to rule that mode out. As for the beeline, it's currently restricted to 8-minute headways because they value engineered out a vent shaft under the Cahuenga Pass when it was built. So constructing the extremely expensive old-style heavy rail, which also requires very long grade-separated stations, along with requiring an incredibly lengthy closure of the beeline to build the very expensive junction, it's just not worth it for minimum headways that bad. We're talking about 8-minute headways versus 90-second headways. This is the capacity difference. Also, more travelers from the valley likely head downtown than south to Vermont, so it'd probably add a forced transfer for more riders than it would help with a one-seat ride south. And while it could allow better headways on the D line, which isn't nothing, that's the main benefit, and it's not worth it when weighed against all the negatives, in my opinion. So that means that I'm going to be looking at a standalone heavy rail line, and one that simply needs to be the shorter train, better headways, automated heavy rail system. So I will be evaluating it as such. Let's start by evaluating options for the trunk of the line, and then we'll consider the north and south ends. I'm considering the trunk to be the section from the E line to the C line, or Expo to the 105. As mentioned, heavy rail requires full grade separation, so with that in mind, there are several vertical profiles available to us. Elevated, underground shallow cut and cover as close to the surface as is feasible, underground twin bore at various possible depths, and underground deep single bore. In my master plan from last year, I had considered this line as a potential underground deep single bore, with the stations built largely within offset bore tunnels with an even smaller excavation footprint required. This was a potential option that Bechtel looked at but rejected for the Sepulveda line. I had thought there was a possibility it could pencil out to be cheaper than a twin bore, especially given the lack of need for mined cross passages and excavated crossover caverns. But I likely underestimated the cost of excavating so much more earth from the larger TBM area. And in the end, if we need to go off-street or prefer tunnel boring for any reason, I'm going to opt for the twin bore. Now there is a clear delineation north and south of Gage. This street is so wide south of Gage, and wider still south of Manchester, that this should absolutely be elevated here, despite the feasibility study recommending that only underground twin bore be considered for heavy rail. This is also a part of town with an extremely regular grid of major roads every mile, and so as mentioned, we'll stick to the ideal 1 mile between the stations here, despite the feasibility study recommending stations only every 2 miles between Pico and the C line. So the south end of this trunk wants to serve both the C line Vermont station and Imperial Boulevard, so putting it just north of the 105 here seems best. Remember, I'm using shorter platforms for automated heavy rail here. I'm also drawing this only 1 level above the street without a mezzanine, like the E-line elevated sections, to cut down on costs. Generally, that would require crossing at street level over crosswalks to reach the station in the median, but I don't think that's a big deal, and building stations off to the side of the street and reconfiguring the street will likely be seen as too expensive and disruptive. Building in the median would also allow the side-running BRT to continue to operate without issue, and as mentioned, the BRT should be maintained along the rail as a local service, stopping every half mile and continuing north to Los Feliz to the express of the heavy rail stopping every mile. This station, though, I actually want to build completely off-street to the west, also somewhat suggested by HNTB. If we take property here and settle for slowing the train down on a 500-foot curve on station approach, which isn't a huge deal, we can build an island platform station off-street to allow the tracks to continue over the 105 on a separate bridge, with one of the C-line elevators in between them. If we extend that elevator up and slice through a teeny bit of concrete to reach a new stair over the freeway, we can connect directly to the island platform with a walkway. This all involves much more complex construction over the freeway, but it does afford us an ideal connection behind Fairgates. Moving north, our next station is an island platform just north of Century. And then the same just south of Manchester. And then the same just south of Florence. And then before Gage, we dive into an underground alignment. But what kind? If it sticks with the standard Metro design guidelines, the EIR is probably going to look at twin-bore tunnels with the top of rail being around 60 feet underground. This creates deep, very expensive stations and crossover caverns. Why so deep? Well, that accommodates the common need to leave the street alignment and pass beneath building foundations. Except they're likely studying only a perfectly straight alignment, so would they consider a much shallower twin bore, say only 40 feet underground at top of rail, which would then permit shallower stations? That would be extremely feasible and logical. We'll see what both depth options look like to better understand how much money that could save us. And then, of course, there's cut and cover, which seems like a no-brainer since this is potentially a perfectly straight under-street route. I'll start by acknowledging that Vermont here is narrow, so until decking is on, we're basically turning this into a BRT transit-only street or a one-lane each direction mixed traffic street during heavy construction, so there will be more disruption here than on, say, the wider streets of the K Northern extension during heaviest construction of a theoretical cut-and-cover alignment. They may even choose to close the street entirely to just move quicker. But again, this is just until the decking can get put down, which is not that long of a time, all things considered, and business mitigation measures can be taken. And again, at the very least, this should be studied so we can get a true understanding of the level of disruption versus savings, rather than just conjecture. The other critical element to consider with cut and cover is utilities, which bore tunnels generally pass beneath without disturbing outside of station areas, even often at station areas by protecting them in place as they pass overhead. Utility relocations can be an expensive slog depending on conditions along the alignment, but in many cases would still be much cheaper than requiring the insane excavation volumes for stations that a deep bored line would need, especially if reforms to utility permitting pass, which, while they did just fail to make it out of committee in the state Senate, are currently being recommended again by the SB 125 task force and could very well take effect before this line enters construction. Now, the trickiest utility to relocate, as we discussed in the recent Cade North Cut and Cover Part 2 video, are storm drains, as LA has a massive gravity-driven storm drain system that requires constant slopes to drain the water, making large crossing storm sewers in particular rather costly to relocate. And when it comes to storm drains, there's good and bad news along this route. The good news is that, partly due to this being an older part of town than we looked at with the K Northern alignment, the storm sewers here tend to be much shallower. This means it would probably be much simpler and possibly cheaper to lower a cut and cover tunnel slightly and simply protect the sewers in place, something you can generally do even with parallel sewers over a cut and cover tunnel, than it would be to relocate them. The bad news is that, unlike on the lucky K Northern alignment, the storm sewers here are everywhere, meaning that we're likely lowering a huge portion of the entire cut and cover alignment beneath the ideal minimum shallow depth, increasing costs. So, let's see what all three options would look like. Starting with cut and cover, this begins angling down in the 5% slope just south of 67th, enters a trench north of 65th Place, and then is fully underground south of westbound 64th. The storm sewers here are off to the side, indicated by a lighter blue, with a darker blue being crossing sewers, so we don't disturb them at all. There is a tiny sanitary sewer here, which I'm showing in yellow, and which I'm only showing sometimes, where the storm sewer drawings happen to also display them, but I'm ignoring the question of whether these tiny ones will need to be relocated, because that should be much less costly than the giant storm sewers. So, we S-curve to stay under the road, and this 2,500-foot, 60-mile-per-hour curve is the only other real curve unless we end up going with the Westlake MacArthur Park alignment, and it's not exactly slowing down the line. As in my K-line video, I'm using Metro's cut and cover standard, where again, an 8-foot minimum depth from the surface to top of tunnel is preferred for utility clearance, and anything more than that, I'm displaying as purple for excess depth, to help us see where sewers and other concerns will be increasing the cost. But with cut and cover, because these sewers are so shallow, we actually stay completely under the storm sewer system here by default, requiring virtually no excess depth. I have this shallow side platform station with underground pedestrian cross passages spanning Slauson in the event that if a future elevated or underground line does get built here on the Harbor subdivision, it can connect using a crossing elevated center platform station more easily. So we'll either want the main entrances built as seen here, moving the new bike path a little, or with knockout panels here to facilitate connecting vertical circulation being added later. None of this would require any storm sewer relocation. Taking a look at the same section for the board versions, we need to start transitioning to underground earlier, north of 69th, and both the shallower and deeper bore will require relocation of this crossing sewer on 66th. We trench here and enter cut and cover here until we reach this site for a TBM extraction pit. Now, for board lines, you need quite a large space to launch tunnel boring machines, but only a smaller site to extract them. So, for the board versions, I'm launching TBMs going north and south from either the corner of Expo Park or this Ralph's on Adams, as they're the easiest sites to do so, and I'll expand on that once we get there. On this end, this site seems to be the most ideal for a smaller extraction pit. The shallow board version travels underneath the sewers until the Slauson station, which has a shorter mezzanine level that will require lateral sewer relocation just at the station area, which isn't a big deal, and would want to be built similarly to the shallow cut and cover option to allow for a connection to an elevated Slauson line with entrances or knockout panels here. Meanwhile, the deeper board option with a larger mezzanine level that stays totally under the sewers should be built with a gap in the middle of the mezzanine and knockout panels, like this, to allow for a future line, whether it be Metro or Metrolink, to cut and cover under the Harbor subdivision and connect in a similar fashion to 7th Metro Station. Now, Expo is the only one of the 3 stations in this underground section that would need a crossover, so I'm omitting one in the board options for Slauson and Vernon, so we don't have to excavate crossover caverns. For cut and cover, since the tracks are immediately adjacent to one another within the same tunnel instead of being in separate twin tunnels, crossovers can essentially be placed anywhere, and are shorter to boot as the tracks have to span less distance. Sticking with the deep bore, this continues on, barely managing to stay under some extremely deep sewers and a massive water main on 56, while the shallow bore will need to descend deeper here to pass under, and the cut and cover alternative can pass over the water main, thankfully, leaving it undisturbed in all 3 options, but requiring the relocation of the steep storm sewer, which is at least at the very end of a system and thus easier to relocate. The cut and cover will, however, probably want to dive to get beneath a large tricky system from 52nd to 50th and 49th to 45th, but it avoids touching any storm sewers here, including at the Vernon station, which remains pretty shallow. The shallower bore also stays beneath the sewers on station approach, but like with Slauson, its smaller, shallower mezzanine would interfere with the sewers at the station site, requiring easy lateral relocations, but avoiding more difficult crossing relocation. While again, the deep bore, with its larger and deeper mezzanine, would stay beneath everything. Continuing on with the deep bore, it stays under everything to Expo, which requires a massive station box with a crossover cavern and still is beneath all sewers. The adjacent Expo Park Square and parking lot could be a convenient city-owned TBM launch site that's big enough and which we don't need to purchase. If we're hesitant to rip up and rebuild the park, the Ralph's up on Adams, as I mentioned, is another suitable option, but will be pricey. Obviously, it's difficult to get a good direct connection to the E-line here because there's really just not room for one, not even by killing the turn lanes due to the arrangement of the stations here. But if you wanted to make a big project out of this and didn't mind closing this E-line section for some time to do it, you could extend this cut and cover E-line subway through Vermont, undergrounding the maybe not really necessary Expo Park station and then this Vermont station as part of the station box construction, which would then require some more complicated storm drain relocation, but which could make a great E-line connection and speed up the E-line as well. And if you're already closing this, you could extend the closure through Washington Flower and finally fix that goddamn junction at the same time, requiring, of course, gobs of money. From Vernon, the shallow bore also stays beneath everything and requires a crossover cavern, but shouldn't impact any sewers to Expo. And it can accommodate undergrounding the E-line here as well if we just dive a little bit lower at the last second to reach the deeper TBM depth. Meanwhile, our cut and cover variant will still want to dive below crossing sewers at 42nd and 39th, and luckily remains beside the sewers at Expo, allowing for an extremely shallow station which will facilitate quicker E-line transfers and transfers to the BRT, but which still aren't as good as undergrounding the E-line. and of course which would require a shorter closure of the E-line to dig under its tracks. So, for this trunk, 3 vertical profiles. The deep bore's advantages are in touching 0 storm drains outside of the tunnel portal and maybe an E-line connection station, and in allowing for a future crossing cut and cover line on Slauson and the undergrounding of the E-line without adjusting depth. Of course, while I didn't show for the Slauson station, the shallower bore could also accommodate both as well, just diving in those areas, and still creates a shallower, cheaper Vernon station, while its only 2 additional sewer relocations are at station locations, while there will be heavy construction anyways. I don't have any confidence that Metro will consider accommodating for underground Slauson or E-lines though, and if not, then it would truly remove any reason to keep the stations that deep. So I think the conclusion here is that if we bore as shallow as possible, 40 feet to top of rail, and keep shallower stations unless that depth is to accommodate a crossing line, and if they insist on boring deep for no reason, we at least insist on these current and future connection allowances. But what about cut and cover? I initially expected this to be a no-brainer for cut and cover, and then when I saw the storm drains, I thought it'd be the death knell for cut and cover. Oddly, the storm drains didn't end up being quite as impactful as I thought, but the stations for a shallow bore are reasonable enough that I truly don't know if cut and cover would pencil out to saving enough to be worth it, unlike what I suspect on the K Northern extension. I absolutely do think that it should be steadied so we can get the answer, but maybe a shallower bore would make more sense on this line. You could, of course, make cut and cover stations at Slauson and Expo deep enough to accommodate underground crossing lines, but to do so removes 2/3 of the biggest reason in this segment to use cut and cover in the first place, so that would not make a ton of sense. Now let's talk about the northern section. If we bring the line to Wilshire, Vermont, which as far as we know is all of the EIR will be studying, you have to end the line at Wilshire. It's simpler, continuing perfectly straight under the street, and would at least connect with both the B and D lines still, but it kind of screws over one of 2 potential future routes. See, there are 2 northern routes that we'll want Metro to eventually build. Without question, we want one up to Glendale, probably via Echo Park. If the Vermont line went to Westlake, then it would be obvious and ideal for this purpose. But we also want a second line traveling along Sunset and Santa Monica, at least to La Brea, depending on some K-line stuff. This would be obvious as a northern extension of the Southeast Gateway line. But if the Vermont line ends here, then the Southeast Gateway line pretty much has to become our vessel for extending to Glendale, limiting this route to BRT at best unless we build another standalone line. There's a lot of different options of how a bored northern extension of the Vermont line could reach Glendale, and even where it could go from there, but they all remain possible and open to future study with a terminus at Westlake MacArthur Park, which thus must be studied as an alternate potential terminus. So let's see what the line would look like with the 2 potential northern terminals, starting with Wilshire, Vermont. The cut and cover version would have to dive to get beneath this large sewer system between 37th Place and 36th Place, where it starts to interfere with the alignment, and we'd stay below this entire thing to 29th, which would add a fair bit of cost to the cut and cover, and because of another extremely tricky section from Adams to Washington, we're sticking to this depth the whole way, including at Adams Station, which would thus have a mezzanine. None of this is ideal, and makes cut and cover a bit less attractive here, perhaps. Luckily, things get easier for a bit after that, assuming you can actually safely cut and cover under the 10 overpass, which may be tough. I do have Pico Station a little lower to get beneath a crossing sewer that it possibly would just be cheaper to relocate for a few blocks, but if it is this low, then it would have a mezzanine too. We then relocate, or remove as it seems like it may be defunct, a sewer system between 12th and 11th, while remaining above a massive crossing sewer at 11th, and then we go under one at Olympic. finally will stay under 2 more systems, requiring no relocation, while managing a station shallow enough to pass above the B and D line tracks, which will save just gobs and gobs of money and massively reduce disruption time in this area, although tail tracks behind the crossover will require some lateral sewer relocation or removal through 6. This sewer also may be defunct. Now, I'm not sure how this station could connect with Wilshire, Vermont. The feasibility study says that it would with an underground pedestrian passage, but the only knockout panels in the station seem to be at the shallow entrance level and were used when constructing the development above it, which would block it from reaching the new station at that depth anyways. There are no knockout panels on either platform level where it would be ideal to connect, which is one reason why the HNTB proposal preferred a Westlake MacArthur Park terminus. Could you drill through the concrete walls between the support pillars on the platform levels, though? Probably, but I imagine it's extremely delicate and expensive. The best case scenario for the shallow Vermont line station would involve knocking part of the wall of the upper platform level out here and mining out a passage to a cross passage beneath the platforms of the new station. It'd be better to do it on this side of the stair and escalator so you don't have to circle around it then to reach the lower platform level for connections, but there's station support areas in the way, unfortunately. You'd transfer between the westbound lines and the Vermont line like this, and eastbound and Vermont like this. And you can enter here for the B or D lines too. If that worked, none of this would require going up and then down again or vice versa, and you'd have a mezzanine level above the new platforms. So cut and cover gets us a way cheaper terminus, but increases the disruption footprint in this very busy area. Although it's possible to reduce that footprint with a shallow bore. You can see that shallow bore can remain under sewers with no relocations and a small mezzanine atom station, and a small mezzanine pico station, and can still transition to cut and cover somewhere before Wilshire, perhaps south of Olympic, as this could be cobbled together for a suitable TBM extraction site. Further north would be even better, but seems tricky as we want to limit the amount of residential we're taking. Maybe these properties here could work though? Either way, placing this transition somewhere at least gets us the shallow station over the B&D tracks past Wilshire. Alternatively, it can dive for the super f***ing deep option that seems to be the only option the feasibility study indicated would be looked at. An absolutely wild 125 feet underground versus 36. With a required crossover cavern also in the pits of hell, and then bored tail tracks, with TBM extraction happening probably here if this site remains without further development until construction, and HNTB suggested that the insane depth and difficulty of finding a suitable TBM extraction site here were 2 other reasons for a Westlake MacArthur Park terminus instead. But if we did this, we'd possibly connect here with a mined passage to the lower platform level instead, on this side of the stair elevator to the upper platform, which would be the same depth as this new station's mezzanine level. Now, obviously, this alone is why cut and cover at least partly needs to be considered. This deep-ass station causes so many issues and astronomical cost increases that there is no way it's worth it compared to cut and cover from Olympic or 8th to here. For the sake of completeness, let's look at the deep bore version, which of course avoids all sewers like the shallower bore, but with much deeper, more expensive stations. For this section, deep bore has 0 advantages over shallow bore, and shallow bore even really has to convert to cut and cover around Olympic or 8th. It's the only thing that makes sense. But what about that Westlake MacArthur Park terminus option? Well, we're crossing a huge area off-street, so this section will need to be a deep bore at around 60 feet below surface to top the track. And then, unlike Wilshire, Vermont, Westlake MacArthur Park sadly does not appear to have enough space above its B&D tracks, which are in a cut-and-covered structure here, to pass above, requiring them to instead remain below. So this whole section will be bored, and we'll only be looking at one vertical profile. The transition to that profile matters, though. Because of the need to start angling the tracks, every variant of Adams Station needs to be under this Ralph site, and this station will need to be 60 feet deep, since the tracks need to be immediately north of here. But at least excavating that deep off-street would be way less disruptive than doing it on-street. Of course, for the cut and cover transition, you do need to start digging that deep a few blocks back under the street, starting north of 29th, and then the Ralph site would double as the TBM launch pit. It could also, as mentioned, be the main launch pit for the fully bored alternatives as well, and might as well be if we're acquiring it, and both bored trunk options, of course, see a much easier transition. So, we bore deep underneath these neighborhoods, and once we're back under the street grid, we can make this bore shallower and have a small mezzanine station at Pico Union. The MacArthur Park station appears to have knockout panels here, meaning we can connect to the southern portal like this. It'd be more convenient if it was here, but these panels tend to be added more with additional station entrances in mind and not new, deeper line connections. This station would need to be deep beneath the B&D tracks with an excavated crossover cavern and with tail tracks and a TBM extraction pit, perhaps up here under this raw stress for less. This would of course likely be more expensive than a shallow Wilshire, Vermont station, but unequivocally cheaper than the deep one. And this site sets the line up for the future, so this really needs to be on the table. Looking at everything north of Gage, my gut is that a shallow bore with a deeper station at least at Expo for an upgraded connection, and whether it's deep or shallow at Slauson, one that could connect to a future line, makes the most sense. If it goes to MacArthur Park, which it should, we've already got the TBMs in the ground. If they deem it must go to Wilshire, Vermont, the TBMs can at least be extracted at Olympic or 8th for a final cut and cover leg. Elsewhere, cut and cover stations would probably be near enough to the depth of stations from a shallow bore that a shallow bore would be the cheapest way to go. But they should still steady everything north of Gage for potential cut and cover, because how that actually pencils out is something the public ought to know. And if they don't at least steady a cut and cover transition prior to Wilshire, Vermont station for that alternative, then we can confidently label it a supremely lazy steady. Finally, we need to look at the south end, which, according to the feasibility study, would see a final station at 1/20th, bizarrely a mere third of a mile south of where it puts the C-line connection, despite the rest of the station spacing in the feasibility study being every 2 miles. And there's really nothing special here at 1/20th that seems it would require a station, never mind one so close. I mean, there's not even an intersecting bus line on 1/20th. It's just a wholly bizarre decision and a huge potential waste of money, and HNTB in their failed proposal also suggested axing it. And Metro and the BRT study also has a standing recommendation to extend it to El Segundo Boulevard. Meanwhile, there is a strong possibility that the line will have to extend further south, at least with non-revenue tracks, to access an appropriate yard site, which the feasibility study admits is very difficult to locate in the northern section. But honestly, it's difficult in the entire study area. The only way you get a rail yard remotely close to the study area without another wholly new right-of-way is either ripping out this megachurch, which I cannot imagine anyone opting for, or building an elevated track over Union Pacific's El Segundo industrial lead and bringing it to grade beside it at Normandy, grade separating by either raising or lowering the road or the track at Van Ness, and using one of the industrial sites. Probably this one, although it's not even 13 acres, so may be too small on its own and may require one of the adjacent properties as well. This is more than 1.5 miles of new non-revenue track, along with freight relocation, just for yard access. Or, the third option near the study area, using an existing right-of-way but new non-revenue tracks, is the possibility that the feasibility study calls out. using the harbor sub on Slauson to access a site, probably this one, although it's barely over 7 acres and requires 1.14 miles of non-revenue track on the harbor sub, which would make that right-of-way difficult if not impossible to use for another line later, which we really don't want to rule out since, as I mentioned, you can still build cut and cover or elevated and rebuild the pedestrian or bike paths. And additionally, this would require an insanely expensive underground junction just for yard access. It's simply not workable. The contractor's bid hand waves the issue, saying that Crenshaw North is using a yard outside the study area, so can we. But Crenshaw North is an extension and is using the K-Line's current yard area, so unless this is a B-line extension, which would still have to use the connection to the D-line to access Division 20, this would require building non-revenue connecting tracks to either the E-line of its light rail or B and D lines of its heavy rail, underground with a ludicrously expensive junction, and all that for an extremely clunky solution that would probably be an operations nightmare. So, unless we want this option with its extensive non-revenue track, we need to venture outside the study area further south, where there's possibilities to keep much of the new track as useful revenue track. A very attractive option is this derelict property on the corner of Redondo Beach Boulevard and Vermont. It's a little bigger at 16.2 acres, but the adjacent sites, including another Ross Dress for Less, could easily be added if necessary, and you could front the streets with transit-oriented development over the front parts of the yard even. This is probably the best option, being directly adjacent to Vermont. If necessary, though, you could turn the tracks back over Union Pacific's Torrance Industrial Lead to access any sites along this industrial corridor. This will still involve building a new bridge over the 110, though, and will get expensive fast. If you were to bring the line all the way down to Harbor Gateway Transit Center, there is a lot of concrete here that can easily fit a yard in a number of places, but as we'll discuss, getting there without going underground again, which we want to avoid, would be tricky, and it's much further south. And then there's this option, the other direction along UP's Torrance Industrial Lead, and a further several blocks of abandoned track to a large lumber yard. This involves a mile of track off of Vermont, but could potentially make sense for reasons I'll soon discuss. Whatever site Metro identifies, though, they should scrounge up the money to purchase it before it can get away from them. We don't want to end up like California High-Speed Rail in Burbank. Now, since any of these options would involve bringing the track at least down to Redondo Beach Boulevard, still elevated in the massive median, I might add, and not underground as the feasibility study suggests, I see no reason why we shouldn't be building stations at, instead of 120th, El Segundo, Rosecrans, and then with half-mile spacing at Redondo Beach Boulevard, and a little north of Gardena Boulevard, or just the latter to keep the 1 mile spacing, though I think both Redondo Beach Boulevard and Gardena Boulevard make sense. Ending it here, just north of Gardena Boulevard, elevated in the end of the median, may require a wider 2-platform station with a pocket track extending over the freight track to work as an interim terminus for now, but it would at least allow turnback trains in the future if desired, and more importantly, it gives us options on how to potentially extend this in the future, because I actually don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that it should continue down Vermont. Here's why. First, south of the 91, density plummets, as you can see in these potential station 10-minute walk sheds colored by population density, which is why the southern study had such low ridership. Second, just south of where I want to put this Gardena station, Vermont narrows again. Very narrow, with structures against the road on either side of it for the next half mile, making the alignment more complex. Third, if we're going to go all the way to San Pedro, which ultimately we'll want, we'll need to shift west to at least Normandy down here anyway. The chief arguments for continuing down Vermont are serving the Harbor Gateway Transit Center, Harbor UCLA Medical Center, and South Bay Medical Center and Harbor Regional Park with easier access to Harbor College. These are at least potentially some serious ridership drivers, although the Vermont South study didn't suggest that they would be enough to make this line remotely logical in the near term. And even if the rail didn't continue here, the BRT could still ably serve all of these locations. But if we did continue down Vermont, well, one of three things would have to happen. Either we'd have to transition the line to underground between Magnolia and Alondra, necessitating that the Gardena Boulevard station be several levels underground for dual bore, and requiring a TBM launch or extraction pit that there's simply not a good place for until maybe the Gardena station site, making that option tricky. Or second option, retransition to cut and cover, requiring a steeper 6% slope to keep it elevated over Alondra, which would interrupt freight rail service for a bit, and going under this channel would possibly require mining or other engineering solutions, and there's barely space to bring it back up to elevated again with a Harbor Gateway Transit Center station before going over the river, so all in all, also probably not super feasible, or at least ideal. Or option 3, we build a half-mile straddle-bent canopy over Vermont here to keep it elevated, which will, to express an understatement, be very unpopular. I think then you continue elevated the whole way over Vermont, as even though it doesn't have that giant median anymore, it can still fit it, requiring a high crossing over the 405, a connection with a future K-line wherever it ends up going, and we'll leave it at Harbor City for now. If it was certain we wanted to do this, it would potentially be worth it to end Phase 1 at the Harbor Gateway Transit Center rather than Gardena just for the connections and perhaps a larger yard. If you wanted to leave all options open, you can end with a Redondo Beach Boulevard station. But what is the other option? Well, when we looked at this site, I mentioned UP's Torrance Industrial Lead. This is an existing in-use freight right-of-way, one that we've already been building beside for half a mile if we end at Gardena, that curves over to Normandy and then turns west again to Torrance. Now, we can continue the line elevated over the freight rail to a station on Artesia Boulevard, shifting the freight tracks over slightly. Then there's plenty of room to get the tracks down to grade and a gentle slope to cross beneath the 405, where the clearance is very forgiving, and back up again on a steeper but still very easy slope. Horizontally, though, I believe there is just not enough room under here for 3 tracks, so we'll need to move the freight tracks all the way to the west and have the northbound heavy rail track take up some current car lanes, probably reducing one direction to 1 lane. But I think here on this part of Normandy, that wouldn't have a huge impact. We then come directly into an optional aerial station at 190th. There's currently not much here other than the site where the 2028 election will inevitably conclude, but SB 79 could now help change that. And then we'll skip a station at where Del Amo would be if it continued, because there is definitely no reason for one here. Now, we can't continue south on Normandy here because this section of the right-of-way has been taken for housing, so we'll go with the right-of-way that curves toward Torrance. From here, there's 2 options. First, you could put a station with mezzanine here before Western, and then bring the line into downtown Torrance on the right-of-way with another station. And then along this open space to the K-line at the Torrance Transit Center. When the K-line eventually, hopefully, continues south, we'll want it to elevate over Crenshaw, possibly by eliminating the southern crossover and tail tracks that are planned, and then it would lower into a trench with the freight track to remain grade separated, which means that we want the elevated Vermont Line station to be another level up with a mezzanine that connects to the K-line and grade separates the entrance to the K platform from the transit center. We can then continue elevated over the Alcoa Spur to the Torrance Civic Center, barely threading between the police station and pool to keep minimal curves without demolishing any buildings and build a station. And then we can elevate it over Torrance Boulevard with an off-street station at Hawthorne, convenient to both the hospital here and Del Amo Fashion Center, one that we could possibly build side platform to retain the possibility of direct access to a future center-running Hawthorne-La Brea BRT line. Not planned, but something that definitely should happen. Then we get an off-street station at Prospect, and end with an elevated 2-platform off-street station at PCH, convenient to Veterans Park and downtown Redondo Beach. Or you can instead eliminate this western station and go down western with a Carson station instead, or my preference, do both of these routes as separate branches by building a flying junction. If we did that, we'd probably want to keep the station at Western Torrance, actually, with the mezzanine to connect with the southern terminus of a western BRT, so people can transfer to both branches, which we can route over here by taking some pavement from this site. Next, then, is that elevated off-street station at Carson, and then one at Sepulveda on-street with a mezzanine to facilitate a future direct connection to a trenched K-line station here, with relocated freight tracks shown beside the K-line in a wide trench. Then we get a station off-street at Lomita, and then a station off-street at PCH. You can see that the station walk sheds between Carson and PCH are higher density on Western than their theoretical counterparts on Vermont, which should help with ridership. Now, south of PCH, we have another two options that either this or a Vermont all-the-way option could take. If we continue down Western, which can happen from both Western or Vermont like this, we'll have a station off-street past Palos Verdes Drive, and then maybe again off-street here, requiring just a single house, and here at the park. Now, after here, I want to have cut and cover stations, but since the ground slopes down fast, we have no choice but to pop underground here in the median of Western just after the park to be able to stay at the right depth without too steep of slopes. Then we do some minor sewer relocation and take this urgent care and a few houses to bring the line on a gentle curve to a cut and cover station at the hospital here, probably needing to channelize this stream, unfortunately. We continue under 6 with some parallel sewer relocations and a station at Gaffey. And then a 2-platform terminus on this lot. Or, if the lot isn't available in the future, a station under the street with tail tracks. This route has the advantage of not only serving all the development on Western, but also the hospital and more of San Pedro proper. The next option would be cheaper, but also serve significantly fewer people. This second eastern option, which is harder to get to from Western, requiring what would likely be very unpopular elevation over the narrower and more residential Anaheim Street, sees a station here at the oil refinery that will be redeveloped, and then continues over the abandoned Gaffey Street lead until we elevate it over the 110, where it terminates in downtown San Pedro along the waterfront. Because of the port and the cruise line terminal, it isn't exactly blocking beautiful seaside views. I think overall, a southern alignment to the west would be significantly cheaper per mile given the right-of-way, and would have higher ridership, and could conceivably branch to Torrance and Redondo Beach. To serve the area south on Vermont, the BRT could continue down, maybe even taking Gaffey all the way into San Pedro and opening up a lot of areas to transit while still keeping a Vermont one-seat ride possible. This is why I think the best choice for the south would be ending the line for now with an elevated station at Gardena, instead of continuing to Harbor Gateway Transit Center and locking that Vermont alignment for the future, or we could end it back at Redondo Beach Boulevard or earlier just to keep a more expensive southern underground option open if that's important. But it does feel like the tracks are probably going to end up going at least to Redondo Beach Boulevard for a yard anyway. Gun to my head, I would guess that the best option for the line is ultimately a shallow bore to Westlake MacArthur Park, initially built in a massive single phase from Gardena or Redondo Beach Boulevard to Westlake MacArthur Park, due to the need for yard access to the south, but with most of the best ridership being to the north. Or you could phase it on either side of Florence at the vertical profile shift, but phase 1 wouldn't exactly be ideal. So my preference would be a giant 14-station phase 1 built concurrently. The next stage would be to extend it north to Glendale, and then likely further north again, with the southern extension waiting until these areas have densified a bit more, and coming after BRT going down Vermont, Western, and Hawthorne. But then we can build a southern extension to Western, and then to an extended K-line, then PCH, then San Pedro. And then we can add a branch splitting the line with trains to Torrance Transit Center, then Redondo Beach. Now, the major questions. What would the ridership be, and what would this first phase, for which there is currently zero money, mind you, cost? The EIR will, of course, answer those questions for the version it studies, but for this version, let's make some educated guesses. Ridership first. The rail feasibility study estimates a standalone heavy rail option with its 2-mile express configuration would yield 103 to 131,000 daily riders, which is already phenomenal. Its upper end greater than even the best Sepulveda Line Phase 1 estimates, which are around 120,000. We will be doubling the number of stations to 14, with 4 of the new stations, Century, Florence, Vernon, and Adams, being in particularly dense areas, and 2 of the existing stations, Pico and Wilshire, shifting alignment into more dense areas, in fact, one of the densest pockets of the city. Adding stops will reduce speed a little, which may cause a ridership ding, but the insane headways enabled by automated heavy rail should more than make up for that. My estimate for Phase 1 is closer to 175,000 daily boardings, which is a lot. Blows Sepulveda out of the water, and will be a better cost per rider than even Sepulveda All 4. Which bridges us to cost estimates, because Sepulveda is, well, dumb expensive, almost certainly requiring a public-private partnership to finance it, even with its extensive Measures R&M money. Feasibility study estimated that its standalone heavy rail, with only 7 stations, would only cost $5.9 to $6.9 billion in current dollars. Well, from a few years ago. But, there's no way that's accurate, especially not with the way we're designing our legacy heavy rail stations at the moment. To compare, that version of the line is almost the exact same length as Crenshaw North's hybrid alignment, granted with 2 fewer stations, but each station will be much longer for legacy heavy rail instead of light rail, and it needs a wholly new yard that will absolutely require non-revenue tracks and probably an underground junction besides, and the Wilshire, Vermont station will be in the depths of hell. And Crenshaw North is nearly $15 billion. My guess is that an actual EIR of the 7-station standalone heavy rail line from the feasibility study would price closer to $18 billion, literally double what the feasibility study projects. At this point, you're probably saying, and Jesus Christ, you want to double the amount of stations? Yeah, but stay with me here. First, all stations are getting reduced in length due to the automated heavy rail technology, and second, while we'll be adding 2.6 miles of track, it will all be elevated, and it enables a yard directly alongside the alignment. Third, we're shifting 4 miles of the alignment from dual bore to elevated, saving gobs of money there, and only requiring 5.7 miles of tunnel boring. Next, we're reducing the depth of the underground stations. Westlake MacArthur Park will be deep, but not nearly as deep as Wilshire, Vermont would have been. While Adams would be deep, and Expo and Slauson could be, depending on our strategy for current and future crossing lines, Pico Union and Vernon will be shallow. Overall, even doubling the number of stations, that's just 6 underground stations versus 7 for the feasibility study version, and where that study would have 6 deep and 1 wildly deep station, we'd have either 2 deep and 4 shallow, 3 and 3, or 4 and 2, depending on options. Then, 8 of the stations would be significantly cheaper, single-level elevated stations, essentially equivalent to the E-Line's Culver City station in height and length, with only the C-Line station among those requiring any property acquisition. My very rough guess is that ultimately this would come out to be similar in price to the feasibility study version, $18 billion on the low end to maybe $22 billion on the high, even with double the stations. If you want with the feasibility study station location sans 120th, but with my vertical alignments and cut and cover for Wilshire, Vermont, and hand-waving the yard question, it'd probably only be 11 to 13 billion. But let's run with my argument for as high as 22 billion. Basically, another Sepulveda line, and yes, Sepulveda Alt 4 is 20 billion for only 8 stations, with shorter platforms already, 4 elevated and 4 underground, but recall that A, those stations are exceptionally deep, much deeper than any of our stations, and it's using more expensive single-bore tunneling for 9 miles and going under the Sepulveda Pass, and all the elevated stations are multi-level, not single-level like ours, and the overall length is longer, and on Vermont the elevated portions are in a huge median that will require significantly fewer straddle-bent structures and mitigation than Sepulveda. So where do we get that $22 billion? I mean, yeah, that's a tough question, I'm not gonna lie. First, this likely simply doesn't happen without federal infrastructure investment not only returning to pre-Trump levels, but greatly expanding. I sure as hell don't know where our country goes from here, but for this to happen, it will need to be in a better place in a decade or so when we start seriously talking about funding this line. Could it get up to a federal match for $11 billion? It's possible, but let's say maybe $8 billion federal, which is also pretty high, so that's $14 billion to go. You could probably knock out a couple of billion with an EIFD, and then a couple of billion from the state, which would get us down to 10. From there, what do we do? Make it the centerpiece of a new ballot measure? I don't think another sales tax is the right way to fund transit moving forward. It's too regressive. Maybe if Prop 13 is repealed one day, we'll have a lot more property tax revenue to funnel toward transit, which is an ideal way to fund it, but that's also unfortunately the third rail of California politics, to the chagrin of everyone under 50. But maybe. Most likely, I think we're looking at another public-private partnership, which, while not my preferred way to fund infrastructure, I am pretty left after all, seems like the most practical near-term solution to get it done, especially as its metrics will likely be better even than Sepulveda, which has already drawn significant P3 interest. We'll see how much a P3 partner, hopefully Bechtel, pitches in for Sepulveda, but I feel like the cost ratios will end up being similar here, assuming a federal chip-in and substituting sales tax revenue for EIFD and state funds on the local side. But of course, the first step is getting the actual EIR done to get actual figures for cost and ridership and to understand the design impacts. We may be fighting an uphill battle on some other lines that are further along, but we can make sure that this study doesn't make any preventable mistakes, and that this line is the backbone that it can be. So you can send comments to the people in charge of this line right now, and I'm not going to discourage that, but it should go into a scoping period before the EIR starts, at least one presumes, with some community meetings and public comment period, and if so, that will be by far the most effective time to make all these suggestions, which are, if we can recap, ensuring that Bechtel-style automated heavy rail is studied as the technology for the standalone heavy rail alignment. Second, ensuring that elevated rail south of gauge is a vertical profile that is studied. Third, ensuring that cut and cover north of gauge, or at least north of Olympic Area to enable a cut and cover Wilshire, Vermont station, is also studied. Fourth, studying a terminus at Westlake MacArthur Park. Fifth, ending the line further south, my preference at Gardena. Sixth, adjusting the BRT to half-mile station spacing once the rail gets into place, and making the rail 1-mile station spacing. I'm certainly willing to admit that I might be wrong on this, and that it would be better for heavy rail to serve as an express here, but I do think this needs to be looked at. And finally, consider undergrounding the E-line at Vermont Expo as part of this project, and make sure we leave space for a potential future connection at Slauson. That's a lot to add to an EIR, yes, but I think we can scope out the B-line extension and a Wilshire, Vermont terminus before the EIR and just study a local automated heavy rail Westlake to Gardena route elevated south of gauge with a shallow bore north, an express automated heavy rail Westlake to Rosecrans with the same profile, with options for both for cut and cover from Adams to Gage, for undergrounding the Expo line, and an underground Slauson line accommodation. And then the light rail more or less from the feasibility study, which seems prudent to study. This keeps the number of alternatives and options manageable without wasting time studying things almost certain to prove infeasible or impractical. This line is probably one of the furthest off into the future, but it's also one of the only lines so far that hasn't entered study yet, and that makes it the most malleable. It's where we can have the most impact to make sure we're doing this right, so let's give it our best. And for another action item, if you want Vermont BRT to go further south than 120th or El Segundo in the near term, which will be relatively inexpensive, there's a campaign here to try to make that happen. Finally, This video's local organization to support in lieu of a Patreon is Queenscare. Right now, we're staring down the barrel of a lot of people losing their health insurance due to insane price hikes because some assholes didn't want their Thanksgiving travel interrupted. Queenscare is a nonprofit that provides healthcare to low-income people in need, and there are about to be a crushing number of people in need on top of the crushing number of people who are already in need. So, if you can spare a few dollars, this is a good place to send them. The 2025 update is coming, hopefully actually before the end of 2025, but boy is there just a lot to talk about. Stay tuned for it.